Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Jacob Dunne. Now, Jacob is a chap who sadly fatally punched a man in an unprovoked attack back in 2011. And as a result of that, he received a 2.5-year custodial sentence for manslaughter, which he served 14 months. Jacob, let's get on with things. It's great to get you on the Godcast. How are you today, and where are you?
I'm currently under a nice apple tree in my back garden.
Is it you Nottingham guy? Is that right? You're still down in Nottingham?
Yes. Still in Nottingham. Got my Nottingham Violence Reduction Unit top on, which I'm a community ambassador for. And in that capacity, I have a few roles. But in that capacity, I do outreach work in the community and try and stimulate positive dialogue between people within Nottingham who are sadly still in that cycle of gang culture and violence more generally.
Yeah. And this time of year is interesting for you, Jacob. You've got this book coming out very shortly. Just tell us a bit about the book.
Yeah, so the book is called Right from Wrong. It's out the 12th of May, and it hopefully delves into a lot more detail around, my life story, but more, what we need to do as a society to kind of combat these rising levels in violence and conflict more generally.
Is it something you're excited about, or are you anxious about the book coming out? How do you feel about it?
I am, slightly anxious because, I do bear all, and there's no kind of topic that I shy away from. But yeah, quietly optimistic that it will hopefully be useful to lots of people, either people working in the criminal justice system or in education, or even just single mums or parents of young people who are potentially at risk of making some of those poor life choices that I made when I was a teenager, looking to make friends and, how easily it can all go wrong.
Yeah. And how did the book come around, Jacob? Was it as a direct result of the podcast? You did this fascinating podcast called the Punch, which I listened to over the weekend. Was that kind of how the book came about, or was it something a bit longer in the planning for you?
It was something I always wanted to do, but with the success of the Punch podcast or radio series for Radio 4, that whole process kind of just came around a lot quicker than I'd thought it would. So yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind really, because I shared my story on that Radio 4 podcast, and in that series, actually said I think it might be the last time I share my story, because I didn't know, I guess I was losing faith in that narrative that I was sharing, and its usefulness for the public, really.
How difficult, Jacob, is it for you to keep recounting the story? I mean, obviously, on the one hand, it's really important for you to get the story out there, but I guess, and listening to your words in the podcast, every time you talked about it, I was mindful when I did the introduction. Every time you hear it or it's spoken, it's a reminder for you, is it?
Yeah, it's every time I hear it, it is a reminder, and it's a reminder of the worst thing I ever did. And to speak so openly about the worst thing we ever did is difficult in the best of circumstances, but to talk about it in the extent that I have and do, that presents its own challenges, and it's something I've had to kind of learn from and navigate as time has gone on.
Yeah.
Speaking in some settings, I found that it was unhelpful, in the end, like doing one-off news segments where you have a couple of minutes with a presenter to kind of talk about, the complexities of men's mental health and violence, and it doesn't often justify. So I started to, and then other times I'd be going into schools and doing assemblies in front of entire year groups, and you'd walk away, but you'd never really know whether your words had any impact, and it would often be quite draining as well. But yeah, just because of the subject matter and how personal it is to me. So it's a double-edged sword, really.
And the podcast itself, how did that come about? Did the BBC approach you, or I know your story's been out there for quite a while, but did they approach you and say, "Look, we want to do this as a podcast"?
Yeah, there was a producer called Victoria Ferren, freelance producer, and she came across my story, and then originally I think she thought, we could pitch a one-off episode to the Radio 4, but after we got talking, it became clear that we had 4 or 5 episodes worth of content, and we put together an entire series, which actually won Best Factual Series, which I think is probably the accolade I'm most proud of at the moment, because I want to continue being an informative person to engage in these difficult social issues and more broader social issues as the book comes out and I move more away from this story, to more commentating on what the broader issues are.
Yeah. And how do you feel about, when the podcast comes forwards and then the book, are you somebody who's happy to make that decision yourself, or is in the back of your mind, are you thinking about the parents of James, what they might think? Did you ask them about the podcast, for example? Did you make them aware of the book? Have they read the book?
Yeah, so with the podcast, I know you listened and they featured in a couple of those episodes, the parents, and I'm always super conscious that anything I do, even if it brought, positive societal change, it still wouldn't be worth it for me if that brought any kind of unwanted difficulty or to the parents. So as you said, with the book, I've sent them the manuscripts to read through and make sure that there's nothing in there that either they don't agree with or that they would prefer not to be mentioned. And so, yeah, that is, one of the most important things for me is keeping them involved in what I'm doing and making sure that I'm not causing them any more harm than is necessary. And so, yeah, I think we're at a point now where we're starting to kind of take a bit more of a back step on the campaigning together. But we're still in touch, and as I say, that's the most important thing for me, is that our relationship stays strong and healthy over anything else.
Yeah. James, one thing I may have missed or didn't ascertain from the podcast, did James have siblings? Is there any brothers and sisters in the family? And if so, I was wondering how the relationship was with those guys.
As you can imagine, if you were tasked, as restorative justice practitioners are, or you could call them mediators, with navigating such a sensitive and complex conversation, it was important not to bring in too many family members. And so the decision was made that my dialogue would just be between myself and James's parents. He does have siblings, and I think at times, as far as I'm aware, they've not always held the same views as the parents, which is, everyone's allowed their own opinions and allowed to grieve and have and think however they want to think. So yeah, I'm aware that potentially it's not everyone has always had the same views as the people I've communicated with, and that's completely understandable. But yeah, it was agreed early on that our dialogue would be most useful if it was just kept between myself and the parents, and just to keep me safe as well, because there was already two people on that side of the conversation. And I think adding any more may have been quite a lot more intimidating, actually, and I think it would have been more tricky for the practitioners and mediators to make sure they navigated those conversations safely.
And just looking back at that story, Jacob, to that horrendous event, I was wondering how soon after it happened did the remorse kick in, if it did kick in straight away, or whether you explored a way of self-preservation. I suppose I'm just seeking honesty here. You know, was this kind of an immediate kind of, the remorse just kicked in dreadfully, or were you were you fighting for your life, literally?
Yeah, I would probably say I was fighting for my life quite literally. I was scared of connecting with any remorse, because I think in order to show remorse, you need to be accountable. And I don't feel as if at that time, early on, that I really knew how to be accountable, to be honest. And I was scared of being remorseful, because as I say, being remorseful, I believe, in order to be remorseful, you have to acknowledge that you're in the wrong. And so my self-preservation was maintained through feeling as if I was the victim. I was my own victim of circumstances, and that was easier to sit with. It was easier for me to try and blame the criminal justice system or the system more generally, just in terms of schooling and I felt quite marginalized as a young person, which is why I was engaged in kind of gang culture. And so, yeah, the safest thing for me was to just try and not take any responsibility, and that was my way of protecting myself. At times, there were people who challenged me on that. But the other thing is I also had this awareness that how could I ever truly be remorseful without knowing what the real impact of my crimes was? And so sometimes I felt like if I was to think about what I'd done and maybe how the parents were feeling or what the impact of my actions were, that it would leave me in a vulnerable state of not knowing how to move out of that remorse. Because who was going to support me through it? If I did try to think about the victims within this crime, how could I ever understand? Because at this point, I'd never experienced any bereavements of my own. And so, yeah, for all those reasons, I feel like it made it much less likely and for me to take the stance of remorse. And it wasn't until I come out of custody and heard from the parents that I started to consider it seriously.
Yeah. You talked there about victim of circumstances, and I wonder how you reflect on that now, over 10 years later, do you believe there were two victims of your circumstances? Obviously, James being one of them, but I suppose there's an element of truth that you were a victim of your circumstances. Is that how you feel now?
Well, now I'm probably completely the opposite to that man who, had no idea how to even express remorse, never mind feel it properly. I guess now I'm someone who tries to be accountable for everything. It's like almost like my mantra. It's like I've got to own up for my part in any kind of conflict I get involved in. I've got to take accountability for any argument or discussion that gets misinterpreted. And so I try to shy away from acknowledging that I ever was a victim of circumstances. But I'm sure in some respects, taking away what happened and just looking at my upbringing objectively, then I probably was a victim of my circumstance. But that doesn't justify the actions and the ways that I dealt with that.
Yeah. Jacob, I think where I'm going with this, and I don't think I'm breaking any confidences because you talk about the fact that you've got children on the podcast. I wonder what goes through your mind or what you think about in terms of your own kids, in terms of protecting them from your circumstances so they don't become victims of your circumstances as maybe you were with your own family. Do you think about that? And just wondering what your comments might be.
Oh, yeah, I think about that so much. And I think one of the biggest things I try to make an effort with now in my own parenting is to help them be able to communicate effectively. They're only 4 and 2, but what I'm mindful of is what I really struggled with growing up. I was never encouraged to read. I had a very negative opinion of education and what education had to offer. At the and what that does is it limits your vocabulary in terms of being able to actually communicate effectively. And now, so what I'm mindful of now is, I say in the book that I probably had an array of 3 or 4 emotions: angry, sad, happy, and that was about it. And then I had a very limited vocabulary of words that I could use to communicate. And so growing up as a teenager, as a young person who was also diagnosed with dyslexia, ADHD, and on the spectrum of autism, was that I became very, very frustrated a lot of the time. And my way of feeling overwhelmed was to either be violent or to withdraw and not engage, or which is why I got expelled from school, and and that trajectory of them being marginalized, literally, in terms of having your liberty taken away from you. And that compounds because I didn't have the skills to, one, acknowledge how I was even feeling, which is why I work in schools and prisons now, helping men have the emotional awareness of, oh, what is it that triggers me? Oh, what are the type of values that I have that I'm holding on to that are getting me into trouble? What is it about the way I communicate that triggers other people to be hostile towards me? And to go back to your question in a long-winded way about how I try to do that at a very young age with my kids is, when they're expressing a certain emotion, for me to try and help name that emotion so that they can associate how it is that they're feeling. So next time they're feeling like that, now my son regularly says, I'm feeling really sad. And I'm like, oh, that's so good. Like, now he can actually communicate that rather than screaming and rolling around on the floor, which he probably still does, but he's getting there now. He's starting to pick up certain words. He's being able to ask for help, and I think that more than anything is what I value as the most important thing. And I know communication gets banded around a lot, but yeah, for me, it's about giving my kids the tools to be able to express themselves healthily, and so that they can have that trust in me to speak to me, and work through things that will come up for them in their life, and so that they have that emotional resilience to just talk about things.
And
it sounds very simple.
Yeah, you talk about communication and open dialogue. Have you worked out in your own mind, Jacob, when you will tell your children about what happened, or how, and how you communicate that to them? Do you think about that as well? I'm pretty sure you do.
Yeah, I do think about that. I'm not sure when the right time will be. And part of me thinks that, the book will help with that. At any age, they might read that book, when they're in secondary school, or they might read that book when they then have kids, because I've learned so much more, and I have such more insight now I have children, thinking about, the job that my mum did, and the relationship that I now have with my father, who was absent for, quite a while in my life.
Just in terms of the story, Jacob, and just kind of bring the family part of this discussion to a conclusion. I mean, you've, in what is one of the saddest podcasts and stories I've listened to, there is some real optimism. There's some real joy in there. And one of the things, somebody like yourself who had a really shocking education, through my fault, really, not others, but you've gone on to excel in academia. You've got a first in your degree. Is there any resentment about your childhood now, or have you matured to kind of put it into some sort of context?
I really, make a mindful, conscious decision I don't want to hold on to any resentment of any kind. And if I do, then I need to communicate it with, I guess it's a bit more tricky when you're talking about, it's not an individual. We're talking about, my upbringing and experiences of education, and whether I have resentment towards that. Yes. And that's why I often campaign and in the book comment on, what changes I think policy changes would make a huge difference within education and teaching. So I guess that's how I channel any of those resentments. If I have any resentments towards individuals or people that are still alive, then my way of wanting to deal with that is head on, is to kind of understand that, process that, where's that coming from, and then how best might I communicate those feelings so that that resentment doesn't get in the way of, the relationships I have or how I feel. Because at the end of the day, I realized that I was living in a state of resentment towards myself and the world. And I feel like I want to be in control now of how I feel.
Yeah.
And
Jacob, just moving on from there, just briefly about a comment about your time in prison. Was this a place where you're an extension of your masculinity had to continue? You had to continue in some ways being the person that got you into that place originally. And if so, how did you deal with that? And how did you come to let your guard down a bit to, I don't know if softening of the heart is the right word, but what was it that made the change for you?
In prison, it was, I guess, the most unhelpful place for anyone to try and show remorse or take responsibility, because you're surrounded by a cohort of people who generally don't really want to do that. And more so because the conditions that allow people to do that kind of work on themselves, you need a safe space to be vulnerable. And the only place in my whole time in prison where I felt safe to be vulnerable was when the vicar from the chaplain in the prison came and got me out of my cell on the 31st of July, 2012, which was a year on from the day I punched James. And he took me to the chaplain, and we said a prayer, and I just felt for the first time that kind of felt a bit safer to actually think about some of that stuff without feeling uncomfortable or feeling judged.
It's a great link into my next question, Jacob, sorry, because I can't help thinking this as a Christian minister, but forgiveness is at the heart of the Christian faith. And I was going to say, did faith come into your ether? Was it already there? Did you contemplate it while you were incarcerated? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think growing up, my mum and grandma were all women of faith. I'd be taken to school most Sundays, to church most Sundays. I was confirmed, and it wasn't until my got to secondary school that I started being able to get out of going along with my family, all the women in my family. And so I've always had like a sense that, and even in the darkest times, even when I was in that police cell, being arrested for murder at the time, in my darkest hours, and I feel a bit shameful to admit this, but even though I'm not a man that practices any particular faith at the moment, in my darkest hours, I've always seemed to kind of look for something higher, to kind of show me a sign, or to like when I found out that my mum, I got a call from the doctors and they were like, "Oh, your mum's not going to make it past the weekend and she's going to pass away." And I was just like crying out to God. Or when I was in the police cell and was told that I'd been arrested for murder and that someone had died because of my actions, I called out to God, like, "Please, God, like, if you are, out there, like, I'm sorry that this is where I find myself, and that this is the time in my life where I'm calling out." And so I have a peculiar kind of relationship with faith, I guess, really, in that sense. I still see myself as a very spiritual person, and a lot of my own practices now kind of, I guess, align with the teachings of many faiths. Well, I'm not sure if that answers your question, actually.
It really does, Jacob. It just opens, I just want to hear your thoughts. Just again, to just kind of round the forgiveness thing up. One thing I couldn't help but notice in the podcast is that James's father was asked if he could forgive you, and he said he couldn't. Is that something you are reconciled with? Do you hope that might come? Are you hopeful that might come, or do you understand his position?
Oh, I completely understand his position. He's I guess it comes down to what definition of forgiveness you want to use. But David has wished me well, has challenged me, encouraged me to be accountable, been completely honest with me the whole way through about the impact that this has had on him. And doesn't wish me any harm, wants to see me succeed, always encourage me to go into education, and to do all the things that I've been doing. And so for me, that's more than enough than I could have ever have wished for. And I never expected forgiveness from anybody. I'm just grateful that I've had the blessing of goodwill, which some people would say potentially is a form, I guess, of forgiveness, maybe. And Joan has said in some instances that she feels she is forgiven me. But I guess what I've learned, especially working with men in prison, when I do introduce my story to them, not many people in prison or people who've committed harm to others will always have the opportunity to speak to their victims or ever have forgiveness from the people that they've harmed. And so what I have to be mindful of when I present my story is that I can sometimes come from a position of privilege, that I've had those experiences. And a lot of the time I have to coach people that I'm working with away from the notion that their ability to change is not dependent on forgiveness being given to them by somebody else, and that they can find redemption or find an inner peace within themselves without being given forgiveness from somebody else, which is a massive conversation, I guess. And I guess, even in your congregations, I guess, everyone deals with that problem within their lives to varying degrees, I guess. How do we move forward with life with the guilt and shame that all of us will have to varying degrees, depending on who we may have hurt in the past or the poor decisions that we may have made. And sometimes we can stay stuck in that guilt and shame, and hoping that forgiveness from somebody else may set us free. But in truth, I do feel like the forgiveness of self, which is the most difficult version. I guess getting forgiveness from somebody else kind of helps convince yourself that you should forgive yourself. But that, that's still a journey that I'm on. And some days I may wake up and say, yeah, I do forgive myself. Look at all the things I've done, and I can stand proud. And the next week I may have a bad day and feel like burying my head in the sand.
Do you think about him a lot, Jacob?
To varying degrees. Like when I had children of my own, I did a lot. When I turned 28, which was the age he was when he passed away, I felt myself thinking of him a lot more. And so, as I say, I think it's just something that will always, be there. And but it's something that I don't want to dismiss, but I also don't want it to have a detrimental effect on my own mental health either, and my ability to be there for people that
You've got to
depend on me.
function,
And
haven't you? You've got to function.
yes,
Yeah. And what about your mates from that time? Are they still mates, or
yeah.
and how do they
Well,
feel about what happened and where you are now? They must be quite proud of you, and I guess you're a bit of a role model to some of them.
yeah, I've had lots of encouragement from my friends and old acquaintances, some of whom have learnt the errors of their ways and no longer believe in living that kind of lifestyle, and others who are sadly still stuck in that way of being and have no hope of believing that there is anything else, there's any other option to them to be any other way. And so sadly, I just inevitably, there's only two things that happen to people who continue living that lifestyle, and that's either you end up dead or you end up in prison.
And Jacob, just a couple more questions. I could talk to you for ages about this, because it's a great conversation of philosophy, ethics, all these things. But I work on the estates here, very deprived urban area, lots of issues, and I do see lots of young teenagers boys particularly, who I really worry about, whether it's going to be a life of crime or addiction. And I haven't quite worked out a solution to that. I was just wondering if your experience and your incarceration and the events of your life have given you an overview and maybe an opinion of that.
I would say it's about connection. And the more marginalized people become and the less connected they are to positive parts of society, the more difficult it is for people like you and me to help. I.e., for me, keeping people in school, having positive male role models, mentorship, being part of cultures where you can be honest with each other about your feelings, about your dreams, trying to encourage these people to have healthy relationships with their families at home or with people in their communities. Just on a general, if I was going to just comment on that, generally speaking, I would say it's about looking at where the connection is to people and organizations that bring the best out in you. And a lot of the time, these young people on these estates have, they may have passed down trauma from their parents and older generations, and so may not get that at home, but then at the same time they've been excluded from school, and the only connection that they have, where they feel whole or they feel a sense of belonging, ends up being with other socially isolated young people, and they aren't in a position to give you the best advice or to encourage you to be accountable or to push you outside of your comfort zone to see what your potential actually is. A lot of the time with my friends, when I first said I wanted to go into education, a lot of my friends were like, why the fuck what are you going into education for? Why would you do that? You might as well just be on the streets with us. Look at the experiences that we had in school. And I think, it's a travesty that in the United Kingdom, the home of, education and free thinking, and that that we've got to a point now where there's a difference between the terms education and learning. We almost see schools as places where we don't learn. We just go there to do education, not to improve as a person, not to become enlightened, not to challenge our biases, or to, explore our own curiosity. And we end up in these really toxic, unhealthy cultures with just like-minded thinking people. And so that's what I would say. It's about getting people connected to institutions or other people that can both challenge and support them to be better versions of themselves. And
I think you put that fantastically well, Jacob. I completely concur with you. I 100% agree with what you've said, and I think I just wish a few more people would listen to that argument and that point. Jacob, it's been fascinating chatting to you, and so this book's due out anytime. Just remind people again where it's available, who it's out with, how much is it? In all good bookshops and all that.
Yes, all good bookshops available in for pre-order, or if you want to wait till the 12th of May. I've had a little look online at the pricing. The cheapest one seems to be WH Smith. So they seem to be offering it at the cheapest price, and there'll be audio version available as well if people prefer to listen in that format.
What's your voice, is it? You did that, did you?
Yeah, I did.
Was that fun?
It was fun, but very draining. I didn't realize how draining reading out loud is, keeping the right tone, pronouncing all the words properly, and it's a bit of an art. But by the end of it, I was in full flow, and my kids are reaping the rewards now at bedtime when I'm just eloquently reading out loud. Yeah.
And it's out with HarperCollins North, that right? Yeah.
Yes, out with HarperCollins North, I look forward to people getting stuck into it and engaging with me, hopefully.
Yeah.
In the same way that we have now, and how we can start thinking about these things.
And you're on social media, Jacob, are you? You're accessible?
Yes, I'm accessible. Jacob Freeman is my title, or handle, you could call it. Free with 3 E's. And that I got that name. It's not literally because I'm now not locked up anymore and free. It's more because I'm on a continual journey to inner freedom, I guess. That's what I'm trying to hopefully encourage other people to do, to challenge themselves, to know that they aren't fixed in who they are and the views they have today. And that through dialogue and through open discussion and through vulnerability, we can go on that journey of healing and having a better relationship with ourselves and others.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your honesty and your integrity in this conversation, and just thank you for coming on the Godcast, and wish you and everybody connected with your family the very best, and sending our love from the Godcast. Jacob, thank you.
No, thank you very much, and all the best for the future of the Godcast. It's important work that you're doing, and I'll be listening in.